Hey gang, had a straggler just come in that missed the cut for the Halloween special, but hey, I read them all, and it is Halloween. Here's a little bonus for you. One more story. Happy Halloween, everyone. Our campsite, submitted by Bushcrafter68. When I was growing up in Arkansas, my family would go camping a lot, and I learned a lot of bushcraft from my dad. He and I would take trips to a secluded spot in the middle of nowhere where we had permission to be, but no one really went to. It was some land that my dad's best friend owned, and we had free rein to do whatever we wanted to out there. When I was in my early teens, we decided to build our own bushcraft camp from what was out there, and it became a huge project that we really enjoyed doing. We built a lean-to, windbreak walls, a pretty sophisticated kitchen and cooking area, as well as benches and raised sleeping platforms. This whole thing took us lots of trips out there to build stuff, and it was a huge learning experience for me. All that knocking down of dead trees, sawing them into usable lengths for this or that, and it all gave me some pretty valuable life skills that I still use to this day at home, and of course, out in the woods. I wish I could send you a drawing of what our camp looked like, but just picture a large lean-to with an overhanging roof all made out of logs and then covered with thick cuts of earth and peat. Sleeping platforms underneath, and directly in front of that we had a fire pit area that had room for deflector fires that burned all night in cold weather, and then retaining walls on the south and east portions of the camp, and then a bench on the west edge. It was pretty sophisticated for something two people built out of what was just lying around in the woods. When I was 17, my dad got sick and was in and out of the hospital all the time. And obviously, he couldn't go out to our camp, but he encouraged me to go and bring him back pictures of what I was working on and what improvements I was making. I would go alone a lot of the times, but I would also go with my friend James as he got into it after one or two trips out there with me and my dad. One year, Halloween fell on a Saturday, and we thought we'd skip school on Friday, drive the 5 hours to get there, and spend 2 nights in the woods and then head home. My dad was at the doctor's with my mom, but I told him of my plan and they both gave me the okay. So I borrowed Dad's truck, loaded up our gear, and off we went early Friday morning. We had plans to build a sawhorse and maybe rough out a larger roof over the whole camp, but that would be tricky as we didn't want the smoke from the fire blowing in and around us. I know this is a mess of backstory, but you really need to get a feel for what I'm talking about. I mean, this is a pretty sophisticated camp in an area that's an hour-and-a-half hike from the nearest road and any vague idea of civilization. Now's a good time to mention that the last few times I'd been out there by myself, I'd noticed some things that were odd. One time, I found some cigarette butts in the fire pit. I didn't smoke and neither did my dad, and what was stranger was no fire had been started since my last time out there. There was a half-burned, odd-shaped log that I distinctly remembered from my previous trip, and that was still there. I also noticed there were some strange marks on a tree that was part of one of the retaining walls. They had been cut there with a knife, but I had no idea what they meant. One other time, there was a dead turkey on the edge of the site, but what made it creepy was that it had its throat cut. I mean, the neck wasn't broken, the throat was cut, sliced open, and then straight down its neck. I chalked it up to coyotes or some other animal, and I just dragged it far away from the camp area. And it didn't dawn on me until later that it was weird that no other animal had come in and eaten it. So, back to the present. James and I arrived at the trailhead, which was off a logging road and behind a huge boulder. You couldn't see the truck from the road when it was parked, and I can't stress enough how middle of bumfuck nowhere this place was. We put on our packs, and we're talking about the things we need to do when we get there, and water wasn't an issue as there was a stream close by, but we did have to boil it to make it potable, so that was something we had to put on our list. That also meant a fire, which meant firewood. And if you're a hiker or camper, you know what I'm talking about and how the list gets bigger and bigger. The hike out was non-eventful, and we saw the camp through the trees, and then I saw something else. There was a cross-like structure made out of 2 trees propped up against another right at the edge of the camp. The cross member was resting on 2 broken branches that held it in place. I stopped for a minute and pointed it out to James. When we got up to it, James was convinced it was all just a coincidence and that the branches had just fallen that way naturally. I said, yeah, you're probably right, and we just got to surveying the campsite. The first thing I noticed was that a lot of our firewood was gone. We always cut way more than we needed each trip, so if we ever got out there too late or whatever on the next time, we'd always have firewood handy, ready to burn. I didn't say anything to James, and again chalked it up to something else. I mean, maybe someone passing by had helped himself. I mean, the shit your brain will tell you when you don't want to think about the other possibilities. We cleared out all the leaves that had started to fall from the campsite area, hung our packs on our pegs we made for that purpose, and got to assessing things. James would start looking for logs for firewood, and I would get some to build up the reflector, and then we'd drag the big stuff closer to camp so we could cut everything up right there. It was a sunny day, but when you're in the thick pines, it does get a lot darker a lot faster, and it's kind of dark all day long. It was still warm out too, and bushing it is heavy work. After an hour or two, we were spending time chopping and sawing before we took a break, and that's when we heard this strange yipping noise. Like a little dog, but this wasn't a dog. It sounded like something or someone wanting to be a dog. As soon as we stopped working, it stopped, and we just looked at each other. It didn't come back, so we just shrugged and had something to eat quick. The rest of the afternoon was finding good dead trees to fell and then turn into the frame and fill in for the roof. By 6 o'clock, it was getting dark and time to knock off for the day, and the rest of everything we'd do tomorrow. Now it was time for food, a fire, and a full pulse on some white lightning I brought. We talked about all kinds of stuff into the night after getting a fire roaring for boiling water and then some coals for our steaks. Our bedrolls were set up, and now it was time to just relax. And eventually, I brought up the cross thing again and the other weird stuff that I hadn't told James. He said, man, that's nothing, and not to worry about it. So after we ate, we stoked up the fire, got into our sleeping bags, and were ready to drift off. At around 1 a.m., the fire was going down, so I got up to get some more wood on it. This weird whoop came from somewhere out in the darkness, and James popped up and said, "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said. We just sat there listening. It came again. We couldn't tell where it was coming from, but we still looked into the dark forest. There's nothing there. Okay, we're getting a little freaked out, and we'd both been in these woods for years and agreed we'd never heard anything like that. Both wide awake at this time, I just made some tea, and we sat by the fire being quiet and listening for anything else. About an hour went by, and we were ready to go back to bed when... right behind the lean-to. I mean, this was loud as all hell. I stumbled to my feet with my flashlight and ran around the side of the camp. I couldn't see anything. I did hear some thumping and crunching of leaves and twigs. I mean, something or someone was running away from our camp. "Think it's some sort of animal?" James asked from behind me. "I don't know, I guess." Yeah, lame. I knew it sounded like a person, and James knew it sounded like a person. Well, whatever it is, I'll bet it doesn't come back tonight now that it knows we're awake. Reluctantly, we went back to sleep and nothing else happened. At first light, we were up making another fire for breakfast, and of course we immediately started talking about what we had heard. A turkey? It wasn't a coyote or a raccoon. We both kept talking about it over some bacon, and James finally said, "Fucking Bigfoot," and we burst into laughter. I mean, we kept laughing and stopped worrying about it. And I pointed out that if it was someone or something and that wanted to harm us, it could easily have done so while we were asleep. It got close to us while we were on high alert, and we never even knew it was there. We agreed it was probably just an animal. We got to work on the roof and rigged a tricky bit that had a large hole in some log sections to allow the smoke of the fire to rise right up out of the campsite. This was going to be a great spot for winter or rainy camping. The job took us most of the day, and we got more water and firewood, and soon it was time to relax again before the hike out and the long drive home the next day. We sat there talking about future trips, but after what happened next, we decided there would be no future trips. We made dinner and had a little more shine and then got ready for bed. "You nervous?" I asked James, and he just said, "Bigfoot, dude," and we started laughing all over again. I just looked at him and said, "Happy Halloween, man," and we went to sleep. Nothing happened that night. I mean, not that we heard at least. I just lay there in my bag when it got light out and didn't want to get up and certainly didn't want to go back to civilization in school. Sure, my girlfriend was there, but man, there's nothing like being out in the woods building stuff and just being out there with a friend and just enjoying yourselves and having the time of your life. I remembered I had to take pictures of the roof and the sawhorse for my dad, so I sat up to go over to my pack for my camera, and as I walked towards it, I froze in my tracks. On a tree not 10 feet from our camp, a possum had been stabbed through the neck with a large knife in it, and both of them just hung there. Underneath it, written in what looked like sap but was actually blood, were the words, "Happy Halloween." It looked like a little kid had done it with finger paints, and I just said, "James, get up. We have to go now." He got up quickly and came over to my side and took a look at the thing I was looking at. "Holy Jesus," was all he said. "Oh, holy God." I took out my camera and took a picture of it, and like an idiot also dawdled by taking pictures of the other stuff for my dad. I knew he'd want to see them, but in my heart, I immediately knew I was not going to be coming back to this camp ever. We packed up as fast as we could, skipped breakfast, and made sure the fire was out and then double-timed it the hell out of there. We barely said a word until we got to my dad's truck. We just got in and got out. 5 hours later, there we were telling my dad about what had happened sitting in my kitchen. He told me to take the film to a 1-hour place at a pharmacy up the street from our house, and I did. It seemed like forever for this hour to go by so we could see what was on the film and show my dad. When I brought the pictures back, he got on the phone to his friend and repeated our story and said he would mail him some of the pictures to share with the authorities out there. Like that would do anything. We never went back to that camp, and I wonder if it's still standing. We built it pretty well, but I guess by now the wood is probably completely rotten and decayed after all these years. My dad passed 4 years ago, and it's been about 20 years since this all happened. His friend came to the wake and funeral, and at a bar later that night, we talked about my dad and how much he loved the woods and about our awesome camp that we had built on his land. He stopped for a minute and said, "You know, I never told you about this. I honestly just simply forgot. About 10 years after you told me that story about what happened to you, and I told the authorities what you'd seen and given them the pictures, some guys were hiking and camping not too far from where your camp was. They were the nephews of a guy I work with. They came across this weird cabin in the woods, a real ramshackle thing that made them nervous for some reason. They went up to it and looked into a busted window and saw the body of a man that was long, long dead. The body was sitting in a chair, and on the wall was a piece of wood propped up with writing on it. It was barely legible and covered in mold and such, but there were a bunch of dates and events written, like in some kind of log. The last one read, "Missed my damn chance. Kids left." I just looked at him and shook my head. To this day, I'm convinced if we had stayed any longer, James and I would be dead.